This week we're going to take a look at the growing tension of slavery and the expansion in the United States and how this is going to eventually really lead up to the Civil War. So this week and next is going to be super important for you for content because this is really going to help you with your final paper on the Civil War itself. Okay, so before you watch this video, hopefully you've watched the clip about the Missouri Compromise because that really tells us where we are at that point or at this point. But as the country expands, we start to see a growing issue of slavery becoming a huge issue. And really this is because we've gotten the Louisiana Purchase and cotton is very difficult on the soil, and so people are moving out west as population grows, but also as a demand for cotton. At this point, and growing too, America is going to provide about 80% of the world's cotton, so the demand is absolutely huge. Okay, people also start moving out there after a panic of 1819 across the United States for more opportunity. And by 1860, 300,000 people had moved to Oregon and California by that time. Also going on during this time period was Texas, right? So in 1836, can dust off those cobwebs from remembering our Texas history from 7th grade. But essentially, what happened was that Mexico, after getting its own independence in 1821, they needed to start to fill their the area, some of the areas that were less populated. And one of those areas was Texas. Not very many people from Mexico were really going up there and settling Texas, or their area of Texas. And so they encouraged Americans to begin settling there. Now, they had outlawed slavery and said slavery could not exist, but people brought their slaves anyway. We know this leads to a lot of conflict between Mexico and Texas, and of course, very famously in 1836, Texas wins its independence from Mexico. Now, Texas goes right into debt almost immediately. And Sam Houston, for instance, is petitioning constantly to get for Texas to become annexed, which means part of the United States. Twice they're rejected. Okay, they don't want to do that because it's going to upset that balance. We know from the Missouri Compromise how important that balance really was. And it's going to remain its own republic for 9 years until 1845 when it is annexed to the United States. Now, in 1844, this is a very important election in the United States. A lot of Southern leaders do want Texas to become another state. But you've got, a man named James Polk, who's our first dark horse candidate, meaning he really, he wasn't a war hero, that people didn't really know much about him, but he campaigned satisfying both the North and the South. He satisfies the South by saying he's going to annex Texas to become part of it. And in the North, he says he's going to, there's dispute between us, Great Britain, and even Russia over the claims in the Oregon Territory. And so he says that he's going to actually campaigns on 5440 or fight, and saying he's going to take that latitude line in 5440. Okay, so Polk wins in this area. He wins the election pretty heartily. So let me move this out of the way so you can see the election and how he wins. And you can tell that it's not sectionalized. People in the North and the South are voting for Polk. Okay, moving on here a little bit. So one thing to note, let me move myself here a little bit again. So Polk, during his presidency, wants to reduce the tariff. Okay, he thinks that hurts the Southerners. He also wants to settle the dispute over the territory. And so I'm going to show you here in just a minute. Instead of 5440 or fight, like what he campaigned on, he actually settles on the 49th parallel. And take a look at that, okay? Here's 5440, what he said he'd fight for. This is the 49th parallel. So he settled for the 49th parallel. He also wants not just Texas. Polk actually sends a whole entourage to talk to Mexico about taking California, but they refuse. This is going to set up tensions between us and Mexico. Zachary Taylor, he sends to Texas along the border between Nueces and the Rio Grande River. And, you know, that was an area, that whole area was contested between Texas and Mexico itself. Shots are fired, and now Polk is going to ask for war against Mexico. All right. You're going to have a lot of critics of the war itself. A lot of people think that this was just a land grab by Polk, and it might have been. Okay, one of his biggest people that were against him was a man named Henry David Thoreau, who was part of the Transcendentalist movement. He was an abolitionist. And he is so upset about this that he refuses to pay his taxes, and he's thrown in jail. While he's in jail, he writes a very famous book called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. You might recognize this because these were ideas that MLK and Gandhi took. Essentially, it was okay to not follow a law that you felt was unjust in a nonviolent manner. Lincoln, a young politician from Illinois, starts to call out the president on this, saying that he doesn't believe that there was really blood that was shed. He says that it was just essentially a land grab. He asked him to show the spot where the blood was shed, which is why it was nicknamed the Spot Resolutions. Basically just saying he was making war just for pleasure. This damages Polk's reputation. This also begins to elevate a young Lincoln to national prominence. Okay, we know that this war is not, this war itself is not long. Mexico doesn't really have much, and the war itself is just a short, really, 2 years. The big part of this are the effects of the war. The Mexican Cession in 1848. This increases America by a third. This fulfills the whole idea of manifest destiny that we learned about a couple weeks ago. And now we've expanded all the way to the coast. Also later on, about 5 years later, we purchased the Gadsden Purchase. And we give $10 million to Mexico for this. It's just an itty-bitty strip of land in the southern part of modern-day Arizona. And it was because we wanted to complete that transcontinental railroad. And where we had before, just north of it, through the Sierra Nevada, was just too difficult to get through. Another very important thing that happens, though, is the Wilmot Proviso. And we're going to start next week by talking about the Wilmot Proviso. But essentially, remember, Mexico had outlawed slavery at this point. And so there was, at the beginning of the Mexican-American War, a Senator, David Wilmot, proposed the idea that it should, slavery should not exist in any territory that we get from Mexico, partially because of the fact that that would be bringing slavery to a place that didn't have slavery, but also because it really felt it would upset the balance of it. It narrowly passes, right? It passes the House, but not the Senate, and this is really going to show us the growing contention between the North and the South over this issue of slavery. Okay, and finally, we can see here, this is the territory that was added on, Texas itself here. We do settle this for the Compromise of 1850, which we'll talk about next week. But almost immediately after 1848, gold is found in Southern Mill, which is modern day, an area very close to modern day San Francisco. And this causes a huge gold rush in California. That's why the San Francisco 49ers are named the 49ers, right? 1849 is when people flood into California. 360,000 people by 1860 to that area. Immigrants begin to flood into the United States from Mexico, South America, and a lot from Asia, even Australia and Europe. San Francisco becomes an absolute boom town. The ratio of men to women, or women to men, is 3 men to 1 woman. This creates, and interestingly enough, people really don't make a lot of money off of prospecting itself. Most of the people that made money during this time are people that were, restaurateurs and hotel and even brothels. That becomes a really big thing, and prostitution was legalized in most of these boom towns, if not all of these boom towns. And so a lot of entrepreneurial type shit was going on, and huge growth to California. Okay, so one thing though to keep in mind, that freedom and this growth started to become restricted just to whites. White miners start to expel any kind of foreign miners. For example, the Chinese, where they initially came for prospecting, eventually become entrepreneurs themselves there, and they also begin working on the Transcontinental Railroad. The Indian population is almost decimated. It goes almost like from 300,000 to 30,000, absolutely almost wiped out. Another group that is initially welcomed but then pushed out are the Mexicans, right? Because there's Mexicans in California, Mexicans that existed, during the Mexican-American War. And so basically what happened under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it stated that the Mexicans that existed there had two options. They could either move to Mexico, or they could get U.S. state citizenship and stay there. And so one man in particular, Mariano Vallejo, encourages people to stay there. He was a former governor of California in Mexico. And but after the gold rush, things changed, right? The U.S. started to pass laws that frequently helped white people and eventually pushed even the Mexicans out. In Vallejo's case, for example, Americans took his land, 300 acres that he had of his own property. So things don't turn out very well for people in Mexico either. So this is where we're really going to end, right? The growth of the United States is really continuing. Understanding this growth is going to be key to understanding why the Civil War itself erupted. Okay, this issue of slave state versus free state is beyond just a moral dilemma, which actually, wasn't as much as you think it would be. It starts to become kind of a power issue. Are the slave states or the free states going to control the United States? So next week we're going to talk about the buildup of the Civil War. That will be a really important one for you to watch. So I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.